1 Timothy chapter 5. We're ready for verse 17. That's all right. No, you're fine. She's fine. She's fine. That'll send shivers up the spine, won't it? 1 Timothy chapter 5. We've been in it for a couple of weeks now. I'm going to get out of it, I promise. In 1 Timothy 5, Paul addresses or begins to address really the treatment of church members. And he talks in the first verse about how to treat church members. And then he begins in verse 3 and goes through verse 16 talking about widows. And he's going to talk about elders and beginning in verse 17. And then when we get over into the 6th chapter, he's going to talk about employee-employer relationship. So how to treat your employer, and in many ways how to treat your employee as well. And so we'll look at those things. But we remember that Paul was a preacher, that he wrote to the preacher Timothy, but he wrote with regards to some dealings or some things going on in Ephesus. So one might surmise, if you look at this, that in Ephesus they were having problems with the widows, and they were also maybe having eldership problems. You might say, I don't see that. I get that. But there's something going on here. Maybe it was just due also to the fact that Paul was just trying to get them to honor the elders. Having done that, that's a tricky thing, to honor elders. Because, really, if you deviate from the norm, you need to get elder approval, which I didn't do. Surprise, surprise. And did it end up getting me in trouble? No. But there's a lot of other things I didn't get out of it either, so that was the sad aspect of it. But honoring the elders is important because really and truly, aren't we supposed to honor all folks? Sunday morning, we're going to talk about being a blessing. And we're going to talk about love and respect and kindness towards others. Just being, learning to be a blessing towards individuals is something that we all need, especially if we define sin as that which contradicts sonship with God and brotherhood with mankind. Well, 1 Timothy 5, Paul talks about honoring elders, giving honor to elders, and it's important. If you want to break somebody down, don't compliment them. Don't pay them any mind. Don't give them any appreciation. Don't do anything for them. Neglect them. And they'll soon quit. But if you'll thank them, and if you'll appreciate them, and you'll tell them that, and you'll honor them from time to time, they'll keep working, and they'll even work harder for you. So what does he say with regards to elders? He says, first of all, verse 17, he says, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. I don't like the word rule. I don't know about you, but I don't like the word rule there. It says, let the elders who rule well. The word itself has the idea of leading. It's not the idea of ruling. We think of ruling, we think of somebody sitting up with a high hand and saying, this is the way it's going to be, and it's my way or the highway. And an elder or an eldership that does that needs to rethink their leadership style. Now, there are times, yes, in which elders must say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And some folks, guarantee you, some folks are not going to like it. And the congregation then, if they are going to do what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 13, to obey them that have the rule over you, they must submit. Now, does that mean that they can't voice their opinion? No. The elders could say, we're going to change the order of worship services. Not that we're going to change worship service. We're just going to change the order. We're going to put the Lord's Supper at the end instead of at the beginning. You might have a feeling for that. That might create problems for you, and you might express that change to the elders is not what you like or appropriate or helpful to you. But you also got to remember, as we do that and we think about that, the difficulty that elders have. You've heard me say I was the son of an elder. He was an elder until he passed away. He was an elder for over 30 years. I have worked with elders. Some of them were good, some of them were not so good. But elders have to take into consideration everybody. They're not just my elders. They're the whole congregation's elders. I've said that. I set that down with some new elders back several years ago. I had an elder that had a problem because I wouldn't do certain things immediately just because he said. And I sat him down and I explained to him, you do understand, while you are my boss, that I'm a minister for the whole congregation and not just for you. Now, I said, well, let's talk about this. And when we got through talking, he said, I understand now. And we had no problem from that point on. So when you look at the word rule, you say, oh man, this just means, he can sit up there as a dictator and he can say this way and that way. But think about what he said, what Paul says. He said it's the idea of leading, and he says he does this well. Well, how does a leader, how does he gain the appreciation of others? How does he do it well? He does it in such a way that he's respected. He does it in such a way that he is not the focus. And so Paul says if he does it well, he's counted worthy of double honor. He should be valued. He should be esteemed. The idea of honor is the idea of esteem or respect, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. It would appear as if, in verse 17, that there were those in Ephesus that were elders that were preachers. Now, can you be both? Yeah. I really don't want to be. I had one congregation where I started working. When I sat down the first meeting, one of the elders said, you will never be an elder here. And I said, thank you. And he thought I was kidding. I wasn't kidding. I don't want to be both. I don't want to be both the preacher and I don't want to be the preacher. Now, sometimes it may necessitate that, and there have been some preachers that have served in the role as preacher and elder, and they've done a tremendous job. And sometimes necessity warrants that happen, and so, that's fine, and that's good. But Paul says here, those that do such, he says, they're worthy of double honor, especially those that labor in the word and doctrine. Now, this might also open the door for a paid elder. In other words, an elder that would be willing to work maybe like an associate minister, or to do counseling, or to visit. If the congregation so saw that maybe this man in his retirement needed a little supplemental income and the congregation could provide it, or maybe it's just due to the fact that they saw as much work being devoted to the congregation as such, they might decide to supplement his income or give him some money. Maybe it becomes his job. Nothing wrong with that. At least it would seem as if. And so Paul goes on to say, he says, for the scripture says, verse 18, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and labor is worthy, or the labor, is worthy of his wages. Which is interesting. Because if you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul's talking about paying preachers. And do you know what verse he uses? The same argument. You don't muzzle the ox. It's found in the Old Testament. You don't muzzle the ox. You don't muzzle him so that when he's working in the midst of grain, he can't take a bite to eat every once in a while. You don't help him along the way. Now, does that mean that we have to have paid elders? I don't think it says here that we have to have paid elders. That an elder has to be one that, if you will, is doing both jobs. But it's all right if he does. Do not receive, though, as he goes further. He says, do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. I charge you before the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. This is a hard thing. Don't receive an accusation against an elder except by 2 witnesses. I know of a young preacher that went and visited a family, and in visiting the family, he received some information on an elder. What was he going to do? It was bad. It really was bad. What was that young preacher going to do? Well, he went through his years of service in that congregation. He never really found anybody that corroborated his story. Nobody else came forward to tell him virtually the same thing. And so he didn't have 2 witnesses to the story. And so he couldn't do anything with it. Only then after he left, he had been gone for a while, and one of the elders, he was talking to one of the elders, and he told them that one of the elders had resigned, and this was the reason why. And he looked at this elder and he said, so you have more than the 2 witnesses? And the elder said, yes. Must have been true. Now, Paul says that when you get an elder, you got to have 2 accusations against him, 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, in part, you might say, well, that goes back to the old law. The old law, you had to have at least 2 eyewitnesses before you could condemn someone. Yeah. But it's also to make sure. Because what you're going to do is very important for the church, but for the soul of this individual. Because you see, as you receive those accusations, notice what he says in verse 20. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all. Expose that individual. The word rebuke there has the idea of exposing them. But it also has the idea of correcting them. Now, what you're trying to do with regards to an elder would be the same thing as what you're trying to do when you practice church discipline in Matthew 18. You're trying to save a soul from death. You're trying to help an individual get right. But also is the idea that you're trying to make sure that the church shines as a beacon in the midst of a dark world. And so Paul says you receive this accusation by 2 or 3 witnesses. You then expose this individual by correcting them, and you do it in the presence of all. But you do it so that the rest also may fear, he says. I don't like the idea of doing things in fear. But we do those things. Don't raise your hand, but those that had children, how many times when your children were little did you say, if you don't do this, I'm going to spank you? If you don't do this, I'm going to do this, that, or the other stuff. I'm going to ground you. I'm going to take away this privilege or that privilege. We do that. Our bosses do that. You know, you do this, you're going to get a bonus. If you do it over here, I'm going to fire you. The idea, though, of fear for these people is just to say, wait a minute. If they'll do this to an elder, they'll do it to me. They'll make sure that I come out with my problem. The idea really is, like I say, to save a soul from death. It's to make sure that the church is pure. It's also to make sure that these folks live right. The end goal of preaching, the end goal of church discipline, the end goal of correcting an elder here, the end goal of straightening anybody out in their life is not to show them up. It's not to make them an individual of public ridicule. It's to help them get to heaven. That's the end goal. That's the aim. And so Paul says then, verse 21 in many ways I think goes with, I know there are some paragraph divisions in some Bibles that have paragraphs, but verse 21 says, I charge you. The word charge there has the idea of I confirm thoroughly before God and Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels. Elect meaning select. It's kind of interesting. He says elect angels. I was reading somebody this morning and he talked about the reason that he said elect angels is because there are some that have fallen. But notice that he says that you observe these things. This be done. This be done. But that it's done without prejudgment or prejudice. That you don't do it with partiality or favoritism. That you're not singling a guy out because he doesn't like this or doesn't do that. You're doing this. Why? Well, to make sure of the reputation of the church and the salvation of the soul. Is there something somebody'd like to say or add or take away from? No, I would say it would apply to anybody. If you have two accusations, if you have two witnesses against an elder, you should go to him. That's my belief. And that gets interesting too. I may be wrong in this, but it would seem to me that this is a doctrinal issue and not an opinion issue. Because you're going to bring him, you're going to charge him. You know, we may differ in opinion, and he may have a wrong opinion. An elder may have a wrong opinion. I've run into plenty of elders that had wrong opinions on things. And, you know, that wasn't something that was to bring him before the congregation and 2 or 3 witnesses. But I've also run into a case or two where it was doctrinal. And that's what I think he's addressing, not the opinion issues. And so, yeah, I think if anybody has 2 or 3 witnesses, he's received an accusation, 2 or 3 witnesses, he ought to go to them. And I'll be laid out. It's pretty tough. It's tough. I mean, it's one of those things you don't sleep for a long time with. And you address people. It's tough.
Do you go to the elder first?
I think personally, I would go to the individual first. And then I would take it to the elders. Mm-hmm. I do, yeah. Yeah. And I may be wrong there. I hope I'm not. I don't want to lead anybody astray. But that's the route I would go. I would go first to an individual and give him the chance, if nothing else, to simply go before the church, say I'm wrong. And then I think that I want to take this a step further based upon not scripture at hand, but society right now as I see it. One of the things that bothers me that's going on in society now is that a man or woman is put up for almost any position. And he or she has done something in the past that's bad. Bad. And they're still condemned for it today. If a man or a woman that's a Christian comes before the church, let's just say, on Sunday and says, I've sinned. I know I've sinned. I was wrong. I ask for forgiveness. Please forgive me. We take them back in the very position which we held them before all of this. Now, I realize the church may want to consider whether if they were an elder or a deacon or a Bible school teacher, may want to reconsider that. But forgiveness is about wiping the slate clean. If one has repented and one confesses the issue at hand. And so, yeah, I think you ought to give the individual a chance. But then if you don't, then you take it to the elders and then, of course, ultimately to the church. So, yes, I do tie it to Matthew 18. But that's a personal thing.
Is this optional or
What? Well, I think it's interesting because of what he says right here in verse 21. Observe these things. Do this. I've been a part of this. And let me tell you, it's not fun. I watched back, 1994, I watched an eldership split just in pieces because an elder wouldn't straighten up and fly right. And it hurt the church badly. And I will say, now I see them recovering. But that's 27 years later. So it's not fun. This is not easy. It's still, you have to keep, or I do, let me put it like that, I have to keep in my mind that the purpose of it is to try to save a soul. When I go to somebody's house that, say, has been negligent in their worship, and I go to them for the purpose of talking to them, it's not fun. But I don't go to talk to them with the idea of saying, you are a terrible person. You are the scum of the earth. You're awful. And I'm more holy than you. And I'm more right. I go with the idea of, look, I got issues too. And I got problems. And I want to help you. And I want you to help me. And that's what everything should be about in the church. The church should be a family that functions as a family. And that's Paul Daugherty's take on that. Anything else? Yeah, I think so. And for me, I realize that I'm in a little different position than, say, just the average member being preacher. But for me, it goes back to the fact that I'm going to be judged upon what I did. As a preacher, I'm responsible to you, but I'm not responsible for you. An elder is the same way. An elder is responsible to the congregation, but he's ultimately not responsible for each individual and the decisions that they make. Now, let me clarify that, because my dad and I went round and round and round on this issue. As a preacher, my responsibility is to preach the gospel. My responsibility is to help Christians go to heaven. But after I have done that, I can't be held responsible for the decisions you make about your faithfulness, your obedience, your compliance to the will of God. I can't be responsible for that. My responsibility was to get you to the point where you saw the truth, and then if you walk away from it, that's your responsibility. However, if I don't fulfill my responsibility in getting to that point, then I believe the Lord will judge me. Elders are the same way. I believe church members are the same way too. Now, you don't fulfill the role from a standpoint of publicly, but if you're good friends with somebody and you see them going wrong, you need to straighten them up. You need to help bring them back in. And like I say, it's not fun, it's not easy. But the purpose is to try to save, and so that's why any of this that's done has to be done in love and gentleness and patience. And so, excuse me. So with great meekness of heart and mind and soul, and love towards the individual, and patience with the individual, and gentleness of soul, both for them and in yourself, you approach them and talk to them. Try to straighten them out. Anything else? But then look at what it says in verse 22. Do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. There's 2-3 different ways of looking at this, and I really hadn't even thought about it till I was reading someone the other day. But with the idea of laying, if you will, don't lay hands on anyone hastily. Laying hands on somebody is the idea of choosing somebody, and can be or was used in Acts 13 with the idea of choosing leaders. And so it could be that in verse 22, Paul is saying, don't choose an elder hastily. Take your time. Think about it. Consider it. Consider who you're choosing. But it also could be looked at from the standpoint of what has just been said in verses 19, 20, and 21. Be very slow about your actions because you want to make sure. And so you yourselves, though, do not want to share in their sins or the sins of others. And so you have a responsibility with regards to yourself. Keep yourself pure. Anything then along that line? No longer drink only water, but also use little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. Now we can engage in alcoholic drink. No. No. Verse 23 is, look at the purpose of the drink. This is a verse that has been used by some to say, well, drinking's all right. That's not what this verse is teaching. This verse isn't teaching, we'll go out and have a little wine. The wine here is probably more like juice, grape juice, but it's for the stomach's sake. It's medicinal. It's not just to relax or to be a leisure activity, but it is for the purpose of what? Your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities, your frequent illnesses. Some men's sins are clearly evident, he says. He changes the subject, verse 24. Some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment. Those of some men follow later. Some are able to hide their sins. There's a sense in which, where is it? It just dawned on me. Is it Psalm 32, if I'm not mistaken? Blessed is he, verse 1 says, whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. I'm trying to read. It seems like my thinking maybe is clouded. I do know that this verse talks about the individual's sins being covered by the forgiveness of God. But then there are those that cover their sin and thus hide their sin. I was thinking it was in this psalm. It may not be. I'm not seeing it as I just kind of talk and read at the same time. But there's the sense in which a sin is hidden, not from the standpoint of the covering of forgiveness, but hidden from the standpoint of others seeing it. Secret sin. Psalm 19 deals with the idea of a secret sin. And so he says here, some men's sins are just out front. But there are those that some follow later, the secret of life. He says, you be careful. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. Finish this statement. The cream will rise to the what? The top. That's what I think it's saying here. Be slow, patient. It almost leads me to wonder, and this is one of those I can't prove, but it almost leads me to wonder if there were in Ephesus, when Paul writes to Timothy, he talks about in chapter 3, elders, the qualifications for elders and deacons. It almost makes me wonder if there were folks in Ephesus, men in Ephesus, that were trying to take the job, if you will, if you'll let me use that term with regards to that office or those offices, that maybe weren't qualified, but were trying to position themselves into those offices. And so Paul is saying, I didn't jump that time, but half of you did. But Paul is saying, don't just choose a man. Choose wisely. Be careful. Anything else? This is a good chapter, but it gets difficult. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Very true. Anything else? Well, I'll have to go back and study that. It just hit me. There is a psalm that uses the word cover with the two ideas. All right. Well, let's get into the 6th chapter then. We've got time. Got a little bit. We can get started at least verses 1 and 2. We've been talking about, as we said, that Paul's dealing with relationships. He deals now with honoring your masters. How do you conduct yourself? What's your conduct in the workplace? He says, let as many bondservants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. And those who have believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren. Rather serve them, because those who are benefited are believers and beloved. Teach and exhort these things. Paul addresses an issue in the book of Colossians, chapter 3. And the issue that he's addressing in the last part, verses 22 following, is what you do, how you act, affects your relationship with the Lord. And so he talks about whatever you do, do all to the glory of the Lord. Well, that's true in this scenario as well as it is in any scenario. He says, live your faith. Let as many bondservants, slaves, servants, as are under the yoke count their own masters. Okay, here's a slave with his master. Let him respect him. Let him count his own master worthy of all honor. Respect your master. Now, in our day and age, and in our setting of America today, it would mean honor your boss. Respect your boss. You don't necessarily have to go buy him a cake every week, but you can honor him somehow, and you can respect him by following what he says, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. In other words, one of the things they're going to ask you, where do you go to church? Right? Where do you go to church? When I was, for 11 months, when I was in working in industry, I had made up my mind before I ever stepped foot on the floor that I wasn't going to tell anybody that I was a preacher. I didn't need to, because it was already all over that plant before I even walked in the plant that they were hiring a preacher. And one lady that she's in her third marriage. When I left, she wrote on my car, she said, I thought I'd never be friends with a preacher in my life, but I am with you. And she is. She's a nice lady, but she really doesn't want anything to do with church. But I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, stigmatized. But I had no trouble with this. Where I worked for those 11 months, I worked with some really good people. A lot of them didn't care about the church or didn't care about going to church anywhere. But one of the things that would be asked with folks, and I would tell them when they asked, because I was given that leeway by HR, that they would say, well, where do you go to church? What do you believe? And so I had the opportunity to tell them. And that's why I tried to behold myself and hold myself up as a person that had good upbringing and a good faith. Because for some of those people, Church of Christ and Paul Daugherty go hand in hand. And that's really all they know about the Church of Christ. Now that's sad, terribly sad. But it works both ways with regards to this, because he talks about you live life as a bondservant. Live a life where you respect your master so that folks don't talk about you, and the doctrine of Christ is not blasphemed. And then he says, and those who have believing masters, those whose masters are Christians. And that was one of the things during Civil War time. That was a little bit of an issue, where you divided the church, blacks and whites, and the blacks were, depending upon where they went, often pushed in a corner or outside or up in a loft. And so you had problems with slaves and masters going to the same church. What do you do? Well, evidently they had somewhat of the same problem in Ephesus. But Paul says here, if you have a believing master, he says, first of all, let them not despise them. Don't look down upon them. And the reason being because you're brethren. You're family of God. You're God's family. But also serve them, because those who are benefited are believers and beloved. Teach and exhort these things. He says, appreciate, be thankful. Appreciate and be thankful for your employer. Appreciate and be thankful for those that you work with and those that employ you and those that you employ. I don't know if I said that word right. I still don't know if I've said it right. You know what I mean. But notice what he says. He says, teach and exhort these things. In other words, don't just do them. Push it, teach it. But it kind of then becomes upon us the same principle. Teach what? Well, teach things with regards to the principle of respecting others, but respecting those that are over you, those that are especially your employer. Anything else? I don't know a lot that I can add there. You might can. It's a great little section. Now, it's kind of interesting because from this point through the rest of this chapter, and that ends 1 Timothy, Paul just kind of gives some general thoughts here and there. He doesn't really focus in on one idea. He's going to start talking about contentment, greed, and he's going to talk about things of that nature as we finish out this chapter. And probably we'll do that. We'll try to do it next week. Don't know that we will. Anything else? Ken, do you mind leading us in a word of prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you for this. Heavenly Father, thank you for this study time tonight. Study scriptures here in 1 Timothy. And how to be a better Christian. And how to respect others, live with others, work with others. Help us take this lesson and move forward in our lives. Heavenly Father, give all those that have been mentioned are sick. Bring us back at the next point in time. Christ, and we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you all. Y'all have a great week.